When you think of the Olympics, what pops into your head? Opening ceremonies, medal counts, that whole humanity united as one filter? Yeah, shut that off. What if I told you the original ancient Olympics had 0 gold medals, 0 national teams, and was just a bunch of completely naked, olive oil-soaked men snapping each other's bones in a sandpit, all for a single tree branch? Would you believe that? Today, we're skipping the feel-good modern sports story. I'm taking you back over 2,000 years to ancient Greece for a full immersive experience of what people actually called the Battle of the Gods. After this, every time you watch the Olympics on TV, modern athletes are going to look like they're playing pretend in a 5-star hotel. Are you ready? Close your eyes. Put down the soda and chips. You are not a modern person scrolling on your phone in an air-conditioned room. Take a deep breath. Smell that. That's a mix of sour sweat, wild thyme, and sun-baked dirt. Welcome to rural Attica, sometime before the Common Era. Here, you are a 14-year-old farm boy, a shepherd. Your entire world is your father's half-dead olive grove and a gravel path leading to the village well. You don't wake up to dreams. You wake up to blinding sunlight and your goat screaming in your face. You think this is your whole life? Think again. Fate is about to grab you by the face and drag it across the ground. You think ancient Greeks spent their days in white robes, debating philosophy next to marble columns? Wrong. Your body is not a temple, it's a survival machine. You're up before dawn every day, herding sheep, sweating through the olive groves, shoulders wrecked like something heavy ran you over, hands so calloused you could use them as sandpaper. Have you ever complained? Not once? Because your grandfather's grandfather ground through the same misery, and that's just how it was. As for those legends of heroes and gods, that stuff is like billion-dollar government projects on the evening news. Sounds impressive, but it has absolutely nothing to do with your life. But here's where the story turns. One afternoon, you're taking a rare break by a dried-up creek bed, trading insults with the village boys. Then the biggest, most obnoxious kid in the village, let's call him Big Bully Brick, points at an ancient olive tree on top of the hill and shouts, "First one to touch that trunk is the strongest guy here." You're usually the quiet one, but something snaps today and you jump up and run. You expect an underdog comeback story. This is actually the opening scene of a horror film. The second your legs start moving, something feels wrong in the best way. While everyone else flaps around like panicking ducks, your feet feel like they're riding on wheels of fire. That brutal rocky slope that normally costs you half your energy, it feels like an escalator. All you can hear is the wind. Everyone else is gasping is miles behind you. Your brain is literally screaming, "Wait, am I flying?" You touch the bark a full 50 steps ahead of Big Brick. He's still halfway up the hill, eating dirt. You're not even breathing hard. And there's a strange, wild rush in your chest you've never felt before. What you don't notice is a pair of eyes locked onto you from the sidelines. Not a trafficker. An old man named Dials. This guy supposedly visited Sparta in his youth. Right now, his old eyes are scanning your thighs, shoulders, and chest like an X-ray machine. He walks over, strokes his beard, and rasps, "Boy, you don't run like a shepherd, you run like a stag. That's a gift from the gods. If you spend your whole life digging mud out here, the heavens themselves will strike you down." Sounds like a wandering master from a martial arts novel handing over a secret technique, right? Except this old man doesn't teach fighting. The word he drops is Olympia. 4 syllables, like a depth charge. The first time that myth has ever felt like a real destination. It blows your tiny little world apart completely. That evening, the old man sits down with your father, a man who normally only cares about harvest yields and rainfall. When your father looks at you afterward, everything has changed. He used to see a free farmhand. Now he sees a lottery ticket. The kind that could bring honor your whole village hasn't dreamed of. The conversation ends. Your father walks over, face like stone, and drops a heavy hand on your shoulder. "Tomorrow, let your brother take the sheep. Your days as a farmer are over." The old man says you must be tested. You stand there in the violet dusk, looking at the familiar hills. You think you've been set free. Don't be naive. The real hell, the kind that makes you wish you were never born, has just opened its doors. Your father takes you into Athens. You think you're heading to the big city for some ancient metropolitan luxury? Wake up. The noise alone could burst your eardrums. Wheels grinding on stone streets, vendors screaming in the market, air thick with roasting meat, exotic spices, and the fermented sweat of hundreds of thousands of people crammed together. Are you imagining some fancy ancient gym with marble baths and silk fans? Completely wrong. Claim. Your father leads you to a walled courtyard on the edge of the city. This is your new home, the ancient Gymnasium. The moment you step inside, you question everything. A massive square dirt pit. Columns all around, and inside, massive, completely naked men with more muscle than you've ever seen in your life. Every one of them is covered in old and fresh scars. Any one of them could be a Marvel supervillain. You, by comparison, are a skinny little chicken who just wandered into the land of giants. And the smell. Take a deep breath. The air is thick and sticky, sharp enough to make your head spin. That's barrels of olive oil baking in the sun, mixed with the dust kicked up by bare feet, with a deep metallic bite underneath pure, testosterone-drenched sweat. Get ready to be marinated in it. Before you can process any of this, you're pushed in front of your new trainer, Coach Philos. You think he'll welcome you? Maybe ask what your goals are? Not a chance. He looks at you the way a butcher eyes a cut of meat. His first and only command, start training. Take your clothes off. That's right. Everything off. Here, you are not someone's precious child. You are a body waiting to be broken and rebuilt. You carefully fold your clothes. A young assistant hands you a jar of olive oil. What happens next will rewire your brain entirely. You pour it into your hands and coat your entire body. Disgusting enough? Wait. Then you roll in a bucket of sand until you're caked in a thick, gritty layer all over. The coach calls it friction and skin protection. Congratulations. You now look like a breaded cutlet ready for the frying pan. Then comes the fitness assessment. Sprints, jumps, weight lifts. Your shepherd-lean body gets demolished by every explosive drill. By the end, you're trembling all over, lungs full of broken glass. You think you can go home now? They hand you a curved bronze tool called a Strigil. Its purpose? To scrape the oil, sand, sweat and dead skin off your body. Imagine dragging a rusty blade across your skin with real force. When it's done, you catch your red, stinging, wrecked reflection in the bronze shield on the wall. That simple shepherd boy from Attica is dead. Now you are just the lowest apprentice in this house of sweat and olive oil. From this day forward, your life becomes an endless horror loop. You thought herding sheep was hard? Compared to this, that was paid vacation. Your coach has one word on repeat. Ponos. Don't mistake it for simple muscle soreness. This is the ancient Greek sacred KPI. Your body is a rough stone, he tells you. I am the sculptor. My tools are your suffering. Pain is not a side effect here. Pain is the point. Your days are locked into a brutal 4-day cycle. Light work on day 1, total destruction on day 2, technical agony on day 3, medium intensity on day 4. Year-round, no holidays, no days off. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Every day, you spend hours lifting stones that feel like small boulders. You sprint through loose river sand like running through quicksand with weights. You spar with veterans who use you as a human punching bag, slamming you into the mud pit hundreds of times a day. Every time your organs feel like they're rearranging themselves, your coach leans in and says, "That's called humility." The food? You were hoping for something nice, maybe some flatbread, figs, a little wine. Coach slaps that fantasy right out of you. He's not just a sadist, he's a hardcore carnivore fanatic. He jabs a finger in your face. You want to be a scholar or a champion? That's food for readers. From that day on, all grains and fruit are gone. Plus, Hunsada, your bowl holds only rough, hard-baked pork and goat. This isn't eating. This is loading fuel into an engine. Coach's logic is brutal and simple. If you want the muscles of a bull, you eat like a lion. In this gym, Coach Philos always carries a sharpened olive wood rod. You think it's a teaching tool? It's your muscle memory generator. If your discus throw is 1/10 of a second too slow, that rod cracks across your back like lightning. No warning, no counselling, just searing pain. In his world, perfection is the minimum passing grade. To avoid being hit, your body must react before your brain can think. Slowly, you learn to block out the pain. To chew your frustration and swallow it whole, Then one evening, dragging your barely functioning body home, you glance at the bronze shield on the wall. You freeze. The scrawny shepherd boy is gone. Staring back at you is a wide-shouldered, thick-cored, rock-hard animal. Your hands are covered in calluses. The confusion in your eyes has been replaced by something cold and razor-sharp. You finally understand. This house of sweat and olive oil, in the most brutal way possible, has taken a useless piece of scrap iron and hammered it into a weapon about to be unsheathed. And next, this weapon is going to be sent into the most insane, most brutal proving ground in all of Greece. Just when you think you're going to train in this muscle-packed gymnasium until you die, the script flips. One morning, 2 dust-covered men carrying bronze staffs walk through the door. The entire room goes dead silent. Even your feral, psychotic coach shuts his mouth without being asked. Who are they? Heralds from Elis, carrying divine authority, here to announce the sacred command that can stop all of Greece in its tracks. The Sacred Truce has begun. This means your abstract 4-year goal just became a countdown on a real calendar. Under this divine protection, the dangerous mountain roads to the games are now under the watch of Zeus himself. Anyone who touches a single hair on your head will face not just human punishment, but divine wrath. Feeling relieved? Maybe thinking about hiring a comfortable horse-drawn carriage for the trip? Say that out loud and your coach will break your legs on the spot. On the day of departure, your father presses a small, worn leather pouch into your hand, just enough coins for bare minimum food on the road. He says coldly, "Bring honor to this family. That's it." And then you walk, nearly 200 kilometers, on foot, because in ancient Greece horses were for generals and warriors. Athletes walked, because this journey is a sacred pilgrimage. You think this is just a long hike? This is a 2-week endurance test, the ultimate check of what your body can take. For the first 3 days, your muscles built for explosive power scream in hot protest at the relentless pace. By the time you reach the Isthmus of Corinth, the other competitors start appearing in packs. You think meeting fellow athletes on the road means campfire bonding and pre-game socializing. The truce means you can't kill each other. It does not mean you're friends. This is a rolling psychological war. A group of Macedonians built like doors passes you, their eyes saying you're a snack they're saving for later. Coach Philos quietly points out a lean Argive athlete walking ahead. Watch how he moves, not a single wasted motion. That man is dangerously disciplined. The competition hasn't started, but the eye kills are already drawing blood. At night, forget warm baths and private rooms. On a good night, you're wedged onto the flea-infested floor of a filthy inn with dozens of other sweating competitors. On a bad night, you're flat on the bare earth under open sky, listening to hundreds of rivals grind their teeth and snore around you. This road is slowly stripping away your last comfort, but strangely, as the journey continues, the landscape starts to feel mythic. Every mountain pass seems to whisper legends of ancient heroes. You realize you're no longer just a poor worker heading to a job. You are a pilgrim walking toward the center of the world. Then one blazing afternoon, with the sun hot enough to melt skin, your forever frowning psychotic coach stops walking. He points at a shimmering wall of city walls on the horizon and says 3 flat words, Elis. You look at that city. Your feet are nearly numb with pain. But there's something in your chest fear and the faintest hint of release. The long road is nearly over. You think you're about to take the podium and reach the peak of your life. Sorry, old friend, you're still too naive. Because inside this city called Elis, a month-long trial, the kind that will push you to the edge of sanity, has just bared its teeth at you. The moment you pass through the gates of Elis, the buzz from the road disappears entirely, replaced by a crushing, suffocating pressure. No cheering crowds, no welcome ceremony. This city for the next month is not a place for living, it's a pressure cooker, stuffed with the best and most desperate athletes from all over Greece. The air is thick with the energy of, one of us is not making it out. Before you can even look around, you're herded like livestock before the legendary panel of Greek judges. These are not referee uncles with whistles and vests. These are Elysian nobles in purple robes, sitting with the energy of divine rulers holding court. They don't even fake a smile. They scan every inch of your body like quality inspectors checking livestock. Under that gaze, does your chest feel like it's shrinking? Good. The real breaking point hasn't arrived yet. Remember your coach forcing you to eat nothing but meat back in Athens, turning yourself into a human beast? The judges ban all of that here. They mandate a return to the traditional Greek diet: coarse flatbread, figs, and a little cheese. You're stunned. It's like spending years grinding for the best gear in a video game, then having the judges pull your pants down at the finals and send you in naked. You look at your coach in panic, terrified your hard-earned muscle will just melt away. He gives you a cold smile and whispers, "The foundation has already been laid." Now they're testing how unbreakable your mind is. For the next 30 days, welcome to the ancient Greek version of a survival game. Wake up, train until your muscles tear, eat tasteless food, pass out, repeat. But the most terrifying thing is watching the massive guy who was flexing next to you yesterday get quietly dismissed by a judge's wave of the hand today. 4 years of blood and sweat gone because a judge raised an eyebrow. That gut punch is worse than scratching 100 lottery tickets and losing every single time. Finally, at the end of this madness-inducing month, Judgment Day arrives. All surviving competitors are assembled in the main courtyard. The head judge unrolls a papyrus scroll and begins reading the names of those who have earned a place at Olympia. Every name called releases one person from hell and plunges another dozen into despair. Each name lands like a countdown to execution. When your heart is about to burst through your throat, you hear your own name. The world goes quiet. You made it. You turn to your coach, and for the first time he gives you a single, quick, firm nod. That one nod is worth more than 1,000,000 coins. That evening, the atmosphere among the survivors shifts. Yesterday you all wanted to strangle each other in the sandpit. Tonight you share cheap watered wine in silence, nodding at each other like veterans of the same nuclear blast, the kind of brotherhood that needs no words. But when the sun rises the next morning, the true sacred pilgrimage begins. You march in solemn formation down the sacred road toward Olympia. This is no longer just a competition. This is an audience with the gods. When you wash the grime from your body in the sacred spring, round the final bend, and see the valley of Olympia ringed with silver-leafed olive trees, your breath will catch. No modern stadium here, just the overwhelming temple of Zeus and the towering mound of ash, the altar of Zeus, built up from centuries of burnt offerings. Standing on this ground, your knees want to give, but don't kneel yet. What's coming next is more terrifying than any execution. That first evening, you're brought to the council house. Cold, dim, choked with sharp incense and raw blood. In the center stands a bronze statue of Zeus, the keeper of oaths, lightning in his fist, face that says, "I dare you to lie to me." At his feet, a freshly slaughtered boar, the bleeding chunks still warm. The metallic smell hits the back of your throat like a fist. This is not a welcome ceremony. This is a mob-level death warning. Cheat, and you end up like this pig cut into pieces. Your turn. You think you just raise your right hand and say some words? Ancient Greeks don't do symbolic. The priest orders you to press your hand flat onto the warm, blood-soaked boar meat. You feel the sticky heat, and you swear loudly, clearly, that you will not cheat. You will not use dirty tricks. Done? Not even close. Your father and your coach must also step forward. They must press their hands into the blood and vouch for you personally. In modern terms, this is called collective punishment. If you cheat on the field, it's not just you, your family, your coach. Your entire bloodline will be destroyed and disgraced for generations. When you drag your shaking legs out of that dark chamber back into sunlight, the world has changed. This is not a sports competition. This is staking your soul on the table and playing for your life, directly under the eyes of the gods. The day after the oath, you think it's finally time to compete? Not yet. Today, you're a spectator. The crowd sweeps you along, and what you hear is not polite applause, it's a roaring, animal thundering from tens of thousands of people. You arrive at the hippodrome, not a royal track. A massive dirt oval carved into the natural hillside, packed with tens of thousands of screaming, betting spectators. The air is horse manure, flying dust, and sharp sweat. Want to know how the ancient rich played extreme sports? Your coach points at the impossibly light, shock-free, two-wheeled wooden chariots on the track and spells out the truth. Their owners are Athenian generals or Sicilian elite. They would never risk their own lives. The men gripping the reins for dear life are hired, expendable drivers from the bottom of society. Win. And the glory and the olive wreath go to the owner. Die. And the driver doesn't even leave a name behind. This is not a sport. This is a billionaire's industrial meat grinder dressed up as entertainment. The starting gate drops. 40 hooves hit the ground simultaneously. The impact sounds like an earthquake. At the deadly 180-degree turn, disaster strikes. One chariot clips the post too hard and explodes into splinters. The driver is launched like a rag doll. The chariot behind can't stop it, rolls over, thrashing horses, wood splintering, animals screaming, the sound tearing through the cheers of tens of thousands. Hollywood wouldn't dare film this scene. But in the Hippodrome, as long as people aren't completely dead, the race goes on. The wealthy owner raises his cup in the stands. The bloodied driver lies in the dirt. Nobody looks twice. You swallow hard. At least your glory doesn't require someone else to die for it. Done? Watching the rich man's death sport? Now it's your turn to descend into your own hell. You walk through the arched tunnel into the main stadium, step out of the shadows into blinding sunlight, and tens of thousands of eyes hit you all at once, like having your skin peeled off in an instant. You and 19 of the greatest all-around athletes in all of Greece stand on the packed dirt. The guy from Thebes next to you has shoulders like a hillside. The Corinthian champion across from you has that unbearable smirk. Feeling nervous and want to hide? Sorry, tens of thousands are watching, and you don't even have shorts to hide behind. First event, discus throw. The Corinthian steps up first. A fluid, elegant spin, and his bronze disc slices through the air for an absurdly impressive distance. The crowd inhales sharply. Then it's your turn. You walk to the line. The disc is cold and heavy in your palm. Tens of thousands of stares burn into your bare back. Nervous? Don't be. This is exactly what those hundreds of rod strikes were for. You don't think about technique. You breathe in, let your body take over, spin, drive, release. The disc cuts through the air like a bronze sun, lands solidly past the Corinthian's mark. You're leading. But before your lips can even curl into a smile, the judge is already rushing you to the next event. Think that was the peak? The next ancient track event is about to make your jaw drop. Second event, the long jump. Except in ancient Greece, you hold a stone weight in each hand like small melons and jump to the beat of a flute player standing nearby. You heard that right. You jump carrying stone weights in rhythm with live music. Get it wrong and you faceplant spectacularly in front of everyone. The confident Corinthian bungles it misjudges his timing, releases the weights too early, stumbles on landing. The crowd groans. The Theban mountain, built more for crushing than for flying, somehow hurls his giant frame through the air and craters into the sand pit like a meteorite. All eyes shift to you. How do you jump farther with extra weight? Absolute anti-physics, but you have a secret weapon. You step up to the line, stone weights pulling at your arms. You close your eyes. Your coach's voice cuts through. Let the stones carry you. Don't fight them. You lunge forward, drive the weights forward in mid-air, then whip them back hard. The recoil shoves your whole body forward another crucial distance. The judge measures. You beat the Theban giant. 2 competitors are quietly eliminated before you even turn around. Third event, the javelin, your nightmare. Your body was built for power and explosion. Javelin demands grace and flow. Asking a weightlifter to perform ballet, you watch the Theban throw pure brute force at it. The shaft wobbles through the air, and the landing is a disaster. A flicker of hope. Then the Corinthian steps up, fingers threading the leather loop at the shaft's center with practiced ease. One effortless whip, and the javelin spirals with razor precision, sticking deep and far. Crushing. You don't need to beat him. But if you throw badly enough, today is over. Cold sweat on your hands. You slot your fingers into the loop, walk to the line. To forget elegance. You take a deep breath, charge forward with everything you have, pour every ounce of survival instinct into your arm, and release, ugly as anything. But the javelin lands clean and upright. Respectable distance. More competitors fall away. 5 remain. Final qualifying event, the stadium sprint. 1 full-length dash. You've already burned through 3 events. Your muscles are screaming. Your lungs are on fire. Bare feet settle into the parallel starting grooves carved in the stone. This is the final squeeze. Are you ready to taste that sweet metallic bite at the back of your throat? Beside you, the lean, lethal Argive runner. On the other side, the panting, meat-mountain Theban. The judge's arm drops. You explode off the line like a cornered animal. Tens of thousands of voices slam into you like a physical wall. The slim Argive takes first place. No surprise there. But you? You grind through sheer willpower, drive yourself across the line in second, leaving the Theban thundering in last. You double over, hands on knees, gasping. Dirt and blood in your mouth. Silence falls over the stadium. The judges huddle, calculating the combined scores of all 4 events. Waiting for the verdict is worse than being stabbed outright. Tens of thousands of people hold their breath. Finally, the herald steps forward, voice filling the stadium. The pentathlon final will be decided by a wrestling match between the top 2 scorers. He glances at the stone tablet, then calls the first name the Theban Mountain. The beast pounds his chest and lets out a thunderous roar. Then the herald pauses for what feels like a century. His eyes lock onto you. Athens, son of Ariston. Every blood vessel in your head nearly blows at once. You made it. You're in the final. But standing between you and that wreath is only one thing. The Theban monster. The man who looks like he could tear you in half with his bare hands. When tens of thousands of people scream your name at the same time, the sound hits you like a physical force. You can feel it in the soles of your feet. No slow motion close-up for you, though. Your companions from the dirt today have all become background scenery. The whole world has narrowed to just you, and the human mountain across the sand pit. You walk to the center. Bare feet sink into the burning sand. Your opponent is already beating his chest, face twisted into a "you're my dinner tonight" grin. You know what real despair feels like now. He's a dedicated wrestler. This is his absolute home turf. And you? A battered all-around athlete running on fumes, with 4 events already draining your blood bar to nearly empty. Right as your stomach drops, your coach charges to the edge of the pit and snarls one final instruction into your ear. Don't fight his strength. Your bones aren't as hard as his. Be water. Use his momentum against you. Stay out of his grip. Sounds like a Tai Chi manual, but in this adrenaline-soaked life-or-death moment, these words are your lifeline. The judge signals. It begins. You circle each other in the pit. The contrast is surreal. He moves like a raging bull, thick neck, wide shoulders, every step denting the ground. You move like an eel, coiling low, tight. Then he does exactly what you expected. He charges like a runaway truck, both hands aimed at your head. You listen to your coach, you sidestep. He crashes through air, lets out a furious grunt, but you can't dodge forever. You lock up. The second you make contact, you feel something genuinely not human. His arms are 2 iron clamps. They close around your ribs. You can hear your own bones beginning to sing a terrifying note. He roars, lifts you clean off the ground, and slams you into the earth. A thunderous impact. Every molecule of air blasts out of your lungs. The sun blacks out for a second. One takedown. The Theban stands over you, fists raised to the crowd. He is 1 point from the wreath. You feel your stomach heave, can hear your coach raging somewhere in the noise, but you can't make out words. Lie down and play dead? This is ancient Greece. Losing is worse than dying. You bite down, push through the fire in your back, and climb to your feet. Round 2. You've woken up completely. Fighting his strength is pure stupidity. You drop your center of gravity low and start moving around the pit, forcing him to turn and chase you. What does a giant fear most? Being run in circles. To Bly, sure enough, he can't grab you, and he's getting angrier, his movements growing ragged. When impatience finally breaks him and he charges again, hands lunging straight for your skull, you see your window. If that hand connects, you're out cold. But this is exactly what you've been waiting for. You drop into a deep crouch, slip under his outstretched arm, spin behind him, and lock both arms around his broad back. Then you drain every last drop of fuel in your body and drive forward. The Theban's feet leave the ground. He hits his back with a look of absolute shock, raising a cloud of sand 3 meters high. The stadium erupts, 1-1. You just toppled a mountain. Round 3, the final round. The real war of attrition. The brutal sun, the full day of exhaustion, both of you are paying the price now. By this point, you both look genuinely horrifying. Sweat, olive oil, sand, your skin has become a cracked, slick mud crust. You're pressed together, chest to chest, barely moving, every second feeling like an entire minute. Heavy, ragged breathing, muscles stretched to the point of snapping. This is no longer about technique. This is a pure willpower duel. Who breaks first? In the midst of this desperate stalemate, you catch a flicker. He's cracking. Overcommitting to one final surge, his hands claw for your neck. Now or never. You tuck your chin, slither through his arms like an eel, lock both hands around his thick back, and with the very last fuel you have left, you push. This one push decides the rest of your life. In that twisted, exhausted tangle of limbs, with the sound of his muscles giving out, he goes down. He crashes to the earth. You collapse on top of him, completely spent. A wall of dust rises over the pit. For a few seconds, your world is nothing but a ringing silence. Did you win? Then a rough hand lands hard on your shoulder. A judge. He grabs your arm and hauls it high into the sky. Takedown. Match over. Lupping. Pentathlon champion. The roar of tens of thousands hits you like a tidal wave. Your mind is pure static. Then the first person to break through the crowd and reach you is your psychotic coach. The man who hit you more than he ever praised you. You expect him to critique your form. Instead, he drags you out of the sand, grabs your shoulders with both hands, and on that 1,000-year ice face, riddled with old scars, something appears. Something rare. Something blazing. Pride. Clear, absolute, undisguised pride. He doesn't say a single word. He just grips your shoulders. That grip alone makes every year of blood, every session of Ponos, every humiliation under the rod worth it. Then another figure pushes through the crowd. Your father. This man who once saw you as a free farmhand. His iron expression has completely crumbled. His eyes are full of tears he can barely hold back. He grabs you with those rough, field-hardened hands, and his voice breaks, barely able to get out your name. You stand in the middle of the dust-filled arena, held up on both sides by the two men who changed your entire life. The noise of the world feels distant. Right now, you're not yet a myth cast in bronze. You're just a son and a student who gave absolutely everything he had. And in this moment, you realize even without the wreath, this would have been enough. The morning after your victory, you wake up in full-body agony, but your soul is floating somewhere near the ceiling. Think it's all over? Think the pentathlon was the most extreme thing here? Keep your eyes open. What you're about to watch today will make your recent memories look gentle. Day 4, the heavyweights, their day of reckoning. You walk into the stadium with your father and coach, and the air itself has changed thick with a primal, head-tingling hunger for blood. First up, boxing. You think this means padded gloves and civilized points? These men wrap their fists in hard leather strips. Their faces no longer look human eyebrow ridges layered with thick scar tissue, noses permanently flattened, ears swollen into misshapen lumps. Your father watches from the side, breathing through his teeth, muttering that these can't be regular men. Have you ever heard a human bone break up close? Not a clean crack. A deep, dull, wet implosion, flesh and bone fragments detonating together. These boxers slowly, methodically demolish each other's faces under the blazing sun. You realize something. You were trained for coordination and explosiveness. These men were forged to take punishment and end people. Think that's brutal enough? Wait until Pankration steps into the arena. This is where you learn what actual hell means. 2 rules only. No biting, no gouging out eyes. Everything else? Go ahead. You think modern MMA is violent? Compared to Pankration, that's children squabbling over candy. You watch 2 men who move like animals, twist and writhe on the ground. One wrenches his opponent's arm backward at an angle that makes no human sense, holds it there until the grinding near-fracture sound forces his opponent to slap the ground in submission. Watching these blood-soaked gods of combat raise their arms, even with your own victory in hand, you know when you're outclassed. Your skill was about winning. 1. Their skill is about surviving. The morning of day 5, the final hours before the awards ceremony. All of Olympia has gone strangely quiet. Your coach leads you down a side path and points out a row of identical bronze statues of Zeus. You think ancient people were all above corruption and cheating? They invented the playbook that modern cheaters are still copying. Your coach tells you coldly, these statues are not tributes to honor. Every single one was funded by fines collected from athletes caught cheating. Bribery to intentionally lose. The names, hometowns, and crimes are engraved on the bases for all of Greece to read. This was the ultimate ancient anti-cheat system. Get caught, and your shame is cast in bronze, displayed in front of all of Greece to be mocked for thousands of years. The original social death sentence, and it lasts millennia. After the cheaters, you turn and see a quieter, even sadder sight. Win and you're a god. Lose and you're lower than a dog. Remember that Corinthian who threw the javelin like he was born doing it? Now he moves like a ghost hunched head down, slipping along the edge of the tent area, quietly packing his things, trying to disappear. No flowers, no applause. He'll take the longest possible route home, praying he doesn't run into anyone he knows. This is the rawest law of the ancient Olympics. Only champions are remembered. Everyone else is erased. Speaking of which, if you think these ancient Greek men were just violent and nothing else, you're right about one more thing. This place was absolutely forbidden to women. If a married woman was caught sneaking in to watch these naked athletes, the punishment required no trial. She'd be thrown off the nearby cliff, but some women refused to accept that. A woman named Kallipateira Widow, determined and completely fearless, disguised herself as a male trainer and personally brought her son to compete. The moment her son won, she was so overwhelmed that she vaulted the barrier. Her robe slipped. She was exposed on the spot. The judges had a problem. By the rules, she should die. But her father, her brothers, and her son were all Olympic champions. Nobody dared touch her. To prevent it from ever happening again, they passed a new rule, one of the most bizarre in sports history. All coaches must enter the grounds completely naked. No hiding anything. 13-ated. Anywhere, but power finds a way. A Spartan princess named Siniska found the loophole in the chariot racing rules. The prize went to the owner of the horses, not the driver. So, she funded an unbeatable team, stayed comfortably at home, and became the first female Olympic champion in history. And the unmarried women of Greece, they started their own festival, the Heraia Games, with their own sacred olive wreath prizes. The women of ancient Greece had been suppressed, but they found their way to fight back. Now, after watching the disgraced and the defiant, it's finally your turn to ascend. You walk alongside the boxer whose face looks like ground meat, and the pankration warrior who makes a hobby of snapping bones, toward the great temple of Zeus. Yesterday you were all trying to destroy each other. Today you walk together like brothers. Tens of thousands throw petals and coloured ribbons as you pass. More than any red carpet ever felt. But at the award ceremony itself, you might want to curse out loud. A judge takes a golden sickle, walks to an ancient tree behind the temple, clips a single wild olive branch, and weaves it into a rough wreath on the spot. He places it on your head. You fought half to death for a twig. Don't even think about complaining. This is called the kotinos. In the eyes of every Greek alive, it weighs more than gold. Because this wreath represents true immortality, you turn around and something shocking happens. Your permanently stone-faced, scar-covered coach is smiling. Genuinely, uncontrollably smiling, all his old scars bunched up together. And your father is weeping openly, pulling you into his arms so tight you can barely breathe. That evening, at the banquet hall, a master poet sits across from you with his lyre and composes a victory ode on the spot, just for you, the Epinician. He takes your story from shepherd boy to champion of all Greece and gives it to the world in song. The ancient Greeks called this kleos glory that outlives the flesh, instant immortality. And the journey home? You left as a poor kid eating dust. You return as a touring superstar. Every village you pass through treats you like royalty, the best food, the best wine, all of it pressed on you freely. When you reach the outskirts of Athens, the entire city has come out to receive you. The city official doesn't lead you through the main gate. He has a section of the solid city wall knocked through, and you ride a 4-horse chariot straight through the gap into the city. You know what that means? It means, with a man this powerful protecting us, what do we even need these walls for? Inside the city, 500 drachmas in cash, lifetime front row seats at the theatre. And every day for the rest of your life, you may eat for free at the city hall, a privilege shared only with heads of state. Your father takes that money and commissions a life-size bronze statue of you for the Gymnasium. Imagine, centuries from now, children will stare up at your likeness in awe. That's more legacy than 10 houses in the best neighborhood. In ancient Greece, winning a championship wasn't just a career boost. It was a direct leap up the social ladder. Some champions became generals commanding armies. Some rose to dominate politics. In some of the most extreme cases after death, people believed that merely touching their statues could heal the sick. From 776 BC, when a cook named Koroibos won the first recorded sprint, this great celebration of men continued for over 1,000 years, but nothing lasts forever. In 393 AD, Roman Emperor Theodosius I decided it was all too pagan and banned the games with a single decree. Then centuries of earthquakes and mudslides buried the magnificent Olympia under more than 20 feet of earth, and it vanished from the face of the world entirely. You think this blood-soaked and glorious history just quietly died? Over 1,000 years later, in the 19th century, a team of German archaeologists dug it all back up out of the mud. Then, in 1896, a Frenchman named Pierre de Coubertin had an idea and lit the flame again. The first modern Olympic Games. 2,000 years had turned. We no longer wrestle naked, and we no longer press our hands into pig blood to make our oaths. But that primal drive to push the absolute limit of what a human body can do, to stand in front of tens of thousands and write your name into legend, that instinct is still carved into every strand of human DNA. Now, here's our second story tonight. The ashes and chains of history. Have you ever considered that history might not be a playback of what actually happened, but a tapestry woven from ambition, power, and fear? In other words, history isn't just about what occurred. It's about what the people in charge decided to let you know. You think knowledge just fades away naturally? Think again. How many of humanity's greatest treasures were fed straight into the shredder, or simply set on fire just because they asked questions that made the powerful uncomfortable? Let's start with the one place every lover of ideas romanticizes: the Library of Alexandria. People picture it as a sacred hall of wisdom, housing 700,000 irreplaceable scrolls. And then, one fire, all gone. Everyone says it was an accident of war, Caesar's siege, flames out of control. But look closer, and many modern scholars are quietly whispering, was it really an accident? Or was it a systematic, premeditated memory purge? Think about what was inside that library. Knowledge that questioned divine authority, challenged the permanence of political power, and documented creation myths that contradicted the official story entirely. For anyone trying to build a new order, those scrolls were live grenades. There's even indirect evidence suggesting that the most dangerous texts were quietly removed before the fire started. What burned may have been nothing more than a cover story. And it doesn't stop there. Have you heard of the Library of Pergamon? Alexandria's great rival, holding 200,000 volumes. Right before it was absorbed into Rome, its most precious manuscripts mysteriously vanished. This wasn't forgetting. This was soft power warfare. Whoever controls the vault of knowledge holds the only microphone for explaining the world. Do you see the pattern? Other. From the very earliest civilizations, power has had one particular obsession: chiseling an enemy's name off a stone monument, burning a library to the ground, labeling inconvenient stories as heresy. Every erasure bends our past a little further out of shape. We're used to history that feels linear, clean, logically consistent, but the truth is usually fragmented, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. The most terrifying thing isn't the burning of books, it's the silence that follows. When no one dares ask what was hidden, the keepers of memory have already won, because the next generation won't even know there was another version of the story. So, are you ready? What we're about to explore is not cheap conspiracy theory. This is a journey toward undeniable, documented suppression of truth. I'll show you ancient texts, expelled from the Bible, remains of giants that the Smithsonian refuses to acknowledge, and megalithic stonework so precise that modern engineers look at it and go pale. What comes next may permanently shift how you see the world. Trust me, once this door opens, every official history you've ever read will start to feel like a movie full of plot holes you somehow never noticed before. So who is holding the pen, writing the lies that all of humanity is supposed to believe? We'll get to that. This first chapter is just the appetizer. The hard stuff is still coming. Chapter 2. Burning books, burying scholars from east to west. Have you noticed that every time someone wants to become the one and only authority, the very first thing they do is never build roads or bridges, it's burn books? Why? Because books hold the memories that could slap them across the face. Let's go back to ancient China and talk about the event that's been criticized for thousands of years, the burning of books and the burying of scholars. A lot of people think the first emperor of Qin was just a hot-headed tyrant. He was actually more like a precision algorithm engineer. In 213 BC, his prime minister Li Si proposed a ruthless plan. Except for books on farming, medicine, divination, and engineering, all historical records of the 6 conquered kingdoms, all poetry, all philosophical classics, must be handed over and burned. You think this was about clearing shelf space? No. He wanted to format the minds of an entire nation. Erase the history of the 6 kingdoms. Make everyone remember only the greatness of Qin. Make everyone feel that history began with this dynasty. Hide a book? Death. Discuss what was burned? Death. The following year, the emperor went further. He had over 400 Confucian scholars buried alive. The message to the entire world was clear. I'm not just burning your books. I'm physically eliminating the people who can still remember what was in them. In the red glow rising over the palace of Xianyang that night, what turned to ash wasn't just bamboo strips. It was centuries of humanity's intellectual heritage. This state-sponsored cleansing of knowledge set a terrifying precedent. Power doesn't just rule land, it rules your memory. But don't think this only happened in ancient China. Shift your gaze to 16th century Mesoamerica. What happened there is brutal enough to shake your faith in civilization entirely. The Maya, a civilization with complex hieroglyphs, sophisticated astronomy, advanced mathematics. They left behind thousands of bark paper codices books recording the secrets of the cosmos. Then the Spanish colonizers arrived. A bishop named Diego de Landa looked at those exquisite Maya manuscripts and said something profoundly absurd. These are the devil's lies. In 1562, in the town of Mani, he ordered the fire lit. Thousands of years of Maya wisdom, astronomical formulas, eclipse cycles, royal histories turned to smoke in a single afternoon. Here's the most bitter irony. After burning their books, De Landa wrote his own account of the Maya writing system. That document became the only key we ever had to decode Maya civilization. The feeling is something like, I killed your entire family, then wrote a memoir mourning you, and the whole world had to thank me for leaving behind the evidence. Today, of the thousands of Maya codices that once existed, only 4 survive in the entire world. All 4 are in European museums. This deliberate cultural erasure robbed indigenous people of their ancestral memory, and with it, their right to define their own identity. Think this feels distant? Look at the lost ancient Buddhist manuscripts of India. In the 13th century, the great University of Nalanda burned for 3 full months. People outside the city could smell the books on the wind. That systematic destruction means we can no longer be certain what the earliest teachings of the Buddha actually said. Notice the pattern? Whether it was Eastern emperors, Western bishops, or invading armies, they all reached the same unspoken agreement. Diversity of thought is a threat to authority. Every burned bookshelf is a piece of brain tissue permanently removed. The history we see today is the damaged, fire-scarred survivor of that destruction. Feeling a chill? Good. Because if the fire was the violent method, the next chapter is about something more sophisticated, hidden in the shadows, using rules and taboos to quietly lobotomize your mind. Chapter 3. Caged Souls, How Theology Became the Gatekeeper of Truth. Have you ever found it strange that a book as thick as the Bible tells some stories in extraordinary detail and then goes completely blurry in other places, like a corrupted video file? Behind that heavy cover, there's an entire spiritual universe that was expelled. Let's talk about the man, the religious establishment, completely blacklisted Enoch. Legend says he was the 7th descendant of Adam, and he was extraordinary enough that God took him up to heaven while he was still alive. He never experienced death. He left behind a book called the Book of Enoch, and what's written inside is enough to give any early church leader a cardiac event. The book describes a group of angels called the Watchers. They defied orders and came down to Earth on their own, fathered children with humans, and then handed over to humanity an entire toolkit of advanced knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, and skills that looked dangerously like forbidden technology. The problem was obvious. If humans could acquire knowledge without going through the church, without divine intermediaries, where does that leave the church's authority? So at the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, the powers that be struck the Book of Enoch from the official canon with a stroke of the pen. A text that had once been deeply revered disappeared from Europe for 1500 years, only to be recovered in a remote corner of Ethiopia in the 18th century. Was that disappearance really just a routine update? But that's not the most extreme case. Have you heard of the Gnostics? Active in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, their ideas were essentially theological nuclear weapons. They believed salvation didn't require church leadership. It came from something called gnosis, a hidden inner knowledge. Imagine you're a senior church official, and someone is out in the streets preaching, "You can reach heaven by trusting yourself, no need to tithe to the church." How threatened do you feel? A systematic, century-spanning cleanup began. Gnostic texts were declared heresy. Possession meant death. How effective was the purge? So effective that for over a millennium, everything the world knew about Gnosticism came from the insults their enemies wrote about them. Then in 1945, an Egyptian farmer dug into a clay jar and found the Nag Hammadi library Gospels that had been sealed away for 1,000 years, finally seeing daylight again. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas contains one particularly explosive line. It says, "The kingdom of God is within you." Think about what that means once it spreads. What happens to every institution that charges a toll for access to the divine? Do you see the common thread? All of these suppressed texts share one feature. They give power directly to the individual and challenge established structures. The job of the gatekeeper is to define what counts as orthodox and lock every restless idea in a dark archive. You think this is just ancient religious politics? Think again. This gatekeeper mechanism is still running today, not just in religion. In medicine, in science, in education, they are all filtering out inconvenient truths, which raises the question, where do all those filtered truths actually end up? The answer leads us to the most mysterious, most extensively stocked archive in human history, the Vatican Secret Archives. 90 kilometers of shelving. Secrets that could collapse your entire worldview. Chapter 4. The Vatican's 90 kilometers of secrets. What's behind that door? Picture this, right next to street. Peter's Basilica in Rome. There's a set of extremely understated buildings. Beneath them, 90 kilometers of shelving. To give you a sense of scale, if you laid those shelves end to end, they'd stretch from one major city to the next. That is the Vatican Secret Archives. A lot of people hear the word secret and immediately imagine alien contact protocols or a DNA report on Jesus. But in Latin, secretum simply means private. Here's the problem. If it's genuinely just personal correspondence, why has it been off limits for centuries? Why did it take until 1881 for a pope to crack the door open, just barely, for a handful of scholars? If you think you can just walk in with a student ID and browse, you're wildly mistaken. The process for gaining access is more complex than applying to a space agency. You must be a credentialed senior scholar. You need letters of recommendation. You must specify in advance the exact document you want to examine. Browsing those 90 kilometers of shelves at will is strictly forbidden. So what are they afraid of? What's locked in there could fundamentally reshape human history. The complete records of Galileo's trial, for instance. The official version tells us it was a clash between science and faith. But those who've glimpsed the files say the real political maneuvering inside was far darker than anything in your textbook. And then there are the secret trial records of the Knights Templar documenting in detail how that powerful 14th century organization was charged, dismantled, and destroyed overnight. But that's only the surface. Have you ever wondered why sacred geometry was stripped out of modern mathematics curricula and reduced to dry formulas? Those ancient proportions and shapes that once connected the spiritual to the physical, why were they quietly hollowed out of their meaning, leaving only a cold, technical shell? Behind that is another invisible hand we need to talk about, the Jesuits. The Jesuits were the most sophisticated educational architects in history. From the 16th century onward, They systematically infiltrated schools and universities around the world. They taught you mathematics. They taught you science. They even allowed you to discuss Copernicus, but always within the boundaries the church had designated as safe. They didn't burn your books. They simply deleted the passages that might give you the wrong ideas from the curriculum. Think of it like an operating system. It appears to let you search for anything. But deep in the base code, certain keywords have already been blocked. You feel like you're exploring freely, but you're actually just walking laps inside a wall someone else built. Even ancient world maps, whenever they challenged the core narrative of Europe discovered the world, would mysteriously disappear from archives or be labelled temporarily unavailable for technical reasons. Here's the bottom line. Whoever controls the archive controls the interpretation of the past. And when that interpretive power has been monopolised for centuries, what we call historical truth is really a model apartment, carefully renovated and staged by someone else. Now, if evidence can be hidden in a vault, what happens when the evidence is too big to hide, like an entire city, or something precise enough to be a machine? The next chapter is about ancient technology so advanced it makes modern experts genuinely uncomfortable. Things that were simply filed away under, we can't explain it, so let's not discuss it. Chapter 5. Giants and Anachronisms, the Smithsonian's Men in Black. Here's a question. If a race of giants actually existed on this Earth, wouldn't that require us to rewrite our entire theory of human evolution on the spot? You might think that sounds like fantasy fiction. But if you go back through American newspapers from the 19th to early 20th century, you'll find these reports everywhere. The New York Times, Scientific American, serious publications, regularly printing stunning archaeological discoveries. In 1877, in Nevada, remains were unearthed measuring between 8 and 10 feet tall. In 1891, giant skeletal remains appeared in burial mounds in Illinois. These giants lay buried beneath those grass-covered mounds, surrounded by finely crafted jewelry and weapons. But here's the question: where did all of it go? The answer almost always points to the same place. The Smithsonian Institution. According to multiple documented accounts, whenever abnormal remains like these were found, Smithsonian representatives would arrive and take charge of the materials. And then nothing. Those remains never appeared in any public exhibition. They vanished entirely, leaving behind only old newspaper clippings and local oral accounts. Many people have suspected that the Smithsonian played the role of historical eraser, deliberately destroying these remains. Why? Because the existence of giants threatened the evolutionary framework and the pre-Columbian North American history model that had just been established. The Smithsonian officially and firmly denies all of it, calling these stories hoaxes, but the lack of transparency itself is the problem. Then there are the scientists who dared to speak up and paid for it. Take geologist Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre. In 1966, she discovered a collection of sophisticated stone tools at a site in Mexico. Multiple scientific dating methods placed them at 250,000 years old. 250,000 years. That's before Homo sapiens even existed. The scientific community's response was not to investigate the data. It was to destroy her career. Her papers were rejected for publication. Her teaching contract was cancelled. She wrote in a letter, "I wasn't rejected because my data was wrong. I was rejected because my data didn't fit the story they wanted to tell." Then there's Canadian archaeologist Thomas Lee. He discovered stone tools in Lake Huron that far predated the accepted timeline. He was fired from his museum position. His materials were locked in a warehouse. He never received a single research grant again for the rest of his life. That kind of soft execution is more chilling than burning a book. Do you see the pattern? In academia, if what you find proves the existing historical framework is a leaking wreck, they don't fix the framework. They fix you. These vanished reports and sealed remains are all telling us the same thing. Official history is strictly curated. Any truth that doesn't fit gets quietly kicked off stage. Chapter 6. The mystery of advanced technology, ancient lightsabers, and computers. Has it ever occurred to you that our proudest modern technology might just be us picking up things our ancestors already figured out and left behind? Let's start with the device that should make every watchmaker question their entire life's work, the Antikythera Mechanism. In 1901, divers recovered a lump of corroded bronze from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. Everyone assumed it was just scrap metal. Then scientists ran a modern CT scan, and what they found inside was an intricate system of precision gears. This was an astronomical calculator built over 2,000 years ago, accurate enough to challenge mechanical clocks from the 18th century. The embarrassing part, according to official history, people 2,000 years ago should have been playing with mud and grinding stones. How could they possibly build something like this? So the device sat in a museum storage room for nearly half a century. Because scholars at the time found it so impossibly advanced, they classified it as an anomaly that shouldn't exist. Some quietly asked, if this technology existed in the ancient world, why did it disappear? Did someone deliberately cut the chain of transmission? Then there's the Baghdad Battery, a clay jar excavated in Iraq in 1936, containing a copper cylinder and residue of acidic liquid. It looks unmistakably like a primitive battery, suggesting people at the time may have been using electricity for electroplating jewelry. Because it conflicted so severely with accepted knowledge of Parthian-era technology, it sat ignored in a museum for decades, until Western media picked it up. But both of these pale next to Puma Punku in Bolivia. You have to see those andesite blocks. Some weigh dozens of tons. The surfaces are polished to mirror finish. The right angle tolerances are less than 1 millimeter. Modern engineers look at these stones among the hardest materials on Earth and say, flat out, without high-precision laser cutters or diamond drill bits, this cannot be done. What's most suspicious? Official excavation of the site largely stopped at the end of the 20th century. Why not continue with modern technology? The stated reason was lack of theoretical framework. Translation: since we can't explain it using existing historical theory, we've all quietly agreed to stop looking. And then there's the underwater structure off Yonaguni Island in Japan. Massive terraces and perfect 90-degree angles, sitting on the sea floor. Professor Kimura led years of research and concluded this could be a 10,000-year-old city. Official institutions immediately declared it natural sandstone formation. Research, funding, was cut. Survey data stopped being made public. Does that mass silence feel familiar? These objects, what archaeologists call oparts, or out-of-place artifacts, are all screaming the same thing at us. The technological history of humanity is not a straight line. It has experienced ruptures and erasures. Those advanced gears, that battery, those stone blocks because they refused to fit neatly into a textbook, they were sent to sit in a storage room and collect dust. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Maps that travelled through time who drew Antarctica before it was frozen. You've probably heard the standard version. In 1820, humanity saw Antarctica for the very first time. Sounds reasonable enough, right? But there is one map, drawn on gazelle skin, that pins that claim to the floor and refuses to let it up. That map is the Piri Reis Map. It was drawn in 1513, more than 300 years before we officially discovered Antarctica, and while Copernicus was still alive. And yet, the southern portion of that map accurately depicts the coastline of Antarctica, particularly a region called Queen Maud Land, in a way that corresponds startlingly to modern satellite imaging. The most extraordinary detail. It shows Antarctica without ice, which means the source material this map was based on may have come from an era when Antarctica was not yet covered by its ice sheet. When Professor Charles Hapgood brought the map to the US Air Force for consultation, the Air Force expert's response was enough to strike the entire historical establishment speechless. The topography on the map closely matched the terrain beneath Antarctica's ice. And yet, mainstream academia responded in a completely unified way. They classified the map as artistic imagination. Even when that imagination is accurate to the level of longitude and latitude, they preferred to call it coincidence rather than acknowledge that an ancient civilization once possessed global cartographic capability. Think only the West has these impossible maps. China's Qing dynasty produced a map called the Complete Map of All Under Heaven during the Qianlong reign. Its level of detail is astonishing. European and African coastlines rendered with navigational precision, and a region labelled Ice Sea that matches Antarctica exactly. It also depicted the continuous western coastline of the Americas in the 18th century, at a time when Western maps still thought California was an island. The Qing government ordered the maps sealed, strictly forbidden from being copied. The stated reason was fear of leaking frontier geography. That instinct is identical to modern academic gatekeepers. When a truth is too far ahead or too inconvenient, the safest move is to lock it in a drawer. And then there are the Polynesians, who navigated thousands of kilometers across the Pacific without paper or instruments, using oral mental navigation charts passed down through generations. Their precision was so extraordinary that Captain James Cook wanted to use their knowledge himself. European navies documented these routes, but by the 19th century, to protect the narrative that Europe was the one and only pioneer of great exploration, those indigenous navigation records quietly disappeared from official sailing manuals. The pattern is clear. Every time off-script evidence surfaces, the powerful either dismiss it as folk fantasy or make it classified. Chapter 8, 2012. The Erased Pharaoh and the Rewritten Record, the Magic of Words. Let's go to ancient Egypt and meet the most unfortunate heretic pharaoh, Akhenaten. This man launched a revolution of earthquake proportions. He decided the old gods were no longer useful, introduced monotheism, and declared that only the sun disk Aten would be worshipped. He built an entirely new capital city, trying to cut all ties with the old power structure. The moment he was gone, his successors chiseled his name off every temple wall, every statue was smashed. In later king lists, he became that criminal, or simply ceased to exist. This is the famous damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Not until the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered the site of Amarna, did we even know this man had existed. But here's the strange part. Although thousands of clay tablets from his reign were recovered, the vast majority have still not been fully published. Many remain locked in storerooms at the Cairo Museum and the British Museum. The given reason: shortage of translators. 1 to 200 years, and it's still not translated? Think carefully about what political secrets might be buried in that silence. Shift to the east, and you'll find this kind of word magic practiced with even more sophistication. We tend to think of the history of song as a detailed and reliable record, but modern scholars have found that this history, written by Yuan dynasty, hands on behalf of the Song dynasty, was filtered through an enormous beauty lens. To make the new dynasty appear legitimate, key figures were mysteriously discredited or erased. Sensitive diplomatic records between the Song and the Jin dynasty negotiations that might have destabilized the new regime were deleted entirely, replaced by a few bland, inconsequential lines. And then there's the Sumerian king list. The original clay tablets record ancient kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years at a stretch. In the 19th century, Western scholars, needing these numbers to align with the biblical timeline, simply changed 28,800 years to 288 years. A stroke of the pen. Thousands of years of civilizational depth trimmed down to the shape they wanted. Whoever holds the eraser holds the power to define the past. When that rewriting becomes routine, what we call history isn't truth anymore. It's a model apartment, dressed up and staged across generations. Chapter 9. Digital Age Ghost Censorship. How algorithms are making you less intelligent. You think Wikipedia and Google search are neutral repositories of knowledge? These platforms have long since become the front line of modern gatekeeping. Let's start with Wikipedia. It claims anyone can edit it. Go ahead and try editing entries on pre-Columbian transoceanic contact or the Piri Reis Map. Even if you're holding solid evidence, the moment it challenges the mainstream narrative, a senior administrator will delete your edit instantly and lock the page entirely. This edit lock power lets a small handful of moderators determine what the historical consensus looks like for billions of people. Former editors have reported that they were instructed to deliberately skew disputed entries specifically to prevent inconvenient history from being associated with the word conspiracy theory. And your search engine? You think results are ranked by truth? They're ranked by algorithm. Platforms like Google Scholar are structurally biased toward established institutions. If an independent researcher discovers evidence that challenges the Clovis first theory of early American settlement, their paper gets quietly buried by the algorithm, pushed to page 10 or beyond. This is what's called content steering. When you search for the stone-cutting techniques at Puma Punku, the algorithm helpfully suggests you search for Puma Punku hoax, instead quietly strangling your curiosity about the truth before it can fully form. Even rare archaeological video footage isn't safe. Sites like Teotihuacan in Mexico and Somerset in England once had documentary films made about them, films that captured evidence of civilizational traces that clearly didn't belong to their supposed era. Where are those films now? Most have been labelled restricted or temporarily withdrawn by national archives. The official explanations are always admirably vague, accuracy not yet verified, protection of the reputations of those involved. The real translation: we don't want you to see footage that can't be reasonably explained. The most hardcore case, Cold War archaeology. You think those excavation teams were just digging in the dirt? Many American and Soviet archaeological projects had intelligence agency involvement. The CIA's Operation Thrush was ostensibly a study of Central Asian civilization and covertly a geopolitical intelligence operation. This partnership produced a deeply distorted outcome. If certain discoveries didn't serve the political needs of the moment or threatened to destabilize historical dominance claims in a region, that evidence went straight into a classified intelligence archive and was stamped never to be declassified. This is what makes digital age censorship the most terrifying kind. It doesn't produce billowing black smoke like a fire. It doesn't carry the overt menace of a banned books list. It just works through lines of code quietly, gently, steering you away from the truth. When you feel most informed, most connected, most certain you have access to everything, you may actually be sitting inside a precisely filtered information bubble. Chapter 10. Closing history as a river, rewritten by power. Let's face a painful truth. History has never been a fixed monument you can walk up to and touch. It's more like a river, endlessly shaped by ambition, power, and fear. For thousands of years, whenever the people in charge decided the current was flowing in the wrong direction, they quietly built dams or simply redirected the river entirely. When ancient empires burned books in great fires, they were not just destroying fragile papyrus, they were destroying humanity's collective memory. When modern academic committees dismiss inconvenient discoveries as lacking consensus, they are building walls to keep thought from crossing its permitted borders. When you can't find those missing archaeological documentaries in a search engine, those digital platforms have already appointed themselves the gatekeepers of truth for this era. Looking back across everything we've covered, the cases are chilling. The Olmec colossal heads, with facial features clearly belonging to a different population group, explained away as an artistic style. The ancient map that accurately depicted Antarctica's pre-ice coastline officially downgraded to beautiful imagination. Excavation footage that once existed and was genuinely recorded locked in vaults, ostensibly to protect academic reputations. Even an institution as large as the Smithsonian suspected of systematically filtering out hard evidence that challenges the mainstream narrative. You might ask, if all of this has been manipulated, does knowing any of it even matter? My answer is, it matters, enormously, because history never truly dies. It lives in every debate that isn't permitted to happen. It lives in every piece of evidence that's been hidden away. And it lives most of all in every person like you who looks at a standard answer and says, I'm not sure this is true, but I want to examine it. Power can chisel a name off a stone. It can seal an archive's iron door. It can even rewrite the code behind a search result, but it can never fully extinguish the human instinct to know what is real. What we need to do is not blindly believe every alternative theory that comes along. What we need is the courage to keep asking questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. The next time you read a historical conclusion in a textbook that feels too clean, too perfectly logical, too neatly resolved, try asking, who had the power to decide this story would be told? And who decided another memory had to disappear? Don't let your mind become a racetrack for someone else's script. The real past may be far more chaotic, far more explosive, and far more fascinating than any official version you've ever been handed. This world doesn't need more people who can recite standard answers on command. It needs people who are willing to speak in the silence. The truth of history may be locked deep inside the Vatican, or buried in the ashes of Alexandria. But as long as we are still thinking, as long as we are still asking, that door to what is real can never be completely welded shut. The truth is out there. Even if right now it's surrounded by darkness, all it takes is someone willing to light a torch, and the light will find its way in. Will you be the one to strike the flame? And now, our third story tonight. Alexander the Great. The real madness. They've been hiding for for 2,000 years. What if I told you that the Alexander the Great you've been worshipping in history class all these years, that so-called beacon of civilization, was actually a serial killer, an ancient crime boss, and a world-class manipulator? Would that shatter everything you thought you knew? But here's what's even more unbelievable. What he built wasn't some great enlightened government. It was a cult held together by fear and spectacle. You might be thinking, didn't this guy conquer all the way to India? Wasn't he basically a superhero? Hold on, don't rush to judgment, because right now we're going to strip off the glittering costume he's been wearing for 2,300 years and look at the dark corners that never made it into the textbook. Think about it. In the ancient world, the most dangerous thing was not being his enemy on the battlefield, it was being his friend. Why? Because enemies at least got a clean death. But his friends? He'd get drunk, invent a charge out of thin air, and torture them slowly to death while everyone around them held their breath and said nothing. So today, we're going in hard. I'm taking you inside rooms that smell like blood, to watch how a completely unraveled mind turned his own army into a meat grinder and crushed entire civilizations underfoot. Ready? We start with a murder, and the victim is his own father. Let's rewind to 336 BC. Aige, the ancient capital of Macedon. Picture the opening of a deeply tense film, think an old master painting. All heavy earth tones and dramatic shadows. Except the underpainting is blood. Alexander's father, Philip II, is standing at the absolute peak of his power. He's just finished grinding the Greek city-states into submission. He commands the most lethal army in the world. He is days away from launching a full invasion of the Persian Empire. That morning, the light is probably blinding. Philip walks into the open-air theatre without his sword, without his shield, wearing a stunning ceremonial robe, head held high. The crowd is cheering. The army is lined up in formation. It's a grand scene. But somewhere in the audience, there's a teenager being crushed by a single question. That's our main character, Alexander. And the only thought running through his mind is one that could drive a person insane. Am I still the heir? Why the panic? Because his father has just taken a new wife, a young woman named Cleopatra Eurydice. And this is no harmless late-life romance politically. It is a weapon aimed directly at Alexander. The bride is pure Macedonian blood. Alexander's mother is a foreign princess. What does that mean? It means the moment this new wife has a son, Alexander the mixed blood, one instantly goes from sole heir to the throne to expendable backup. At the wedding banquet, a drunk nobleman had already raised his cup and toasted the arrival of a legitimate heir. Every word landed like a needle in Alexander's chest. His hot-tempered mother Olympias was furious enough to leave home entirely. This is not a warm royal family. This is a fuse about to detonate. And then it does. Right there in the theatre, as Philip strides proudly through the gap between his bodyguards, a man named Pausanias lunges from the crowd. One thrust. The most powerful king in Macedon crumples to the floor in front of hundreds of witnesses, screaming. The sound of swords being drawn. The assassin runs. Car, pa, car, car. And then the most bizarre scene. The guards don't catch him alive for questioning. They cut him down on the spot. Not a single word allowed out of his mouth. The official explanation is almost insultingly thin. The assassin had a personal grudge, snapped, stabbed the king. End of story. But use your brain for 1 second. How does an assassin slip through the king's bodyguards with that kind of precision? And why kill him immediately instead of taking him alive? There's a theory buried in the ancient texts, one everyone understood but nobody dared say aloud. The mastermind behind this assassination was almost certainly Alexander and his mother. The killer was just a disposable blade. There's not enough evidence to convict, but look at what Alexander does immediately after, and you'll see this is not grief. This is a plan being executed. The king's blood isn't even dry yet. This 20-year-old, not yet crowned, moves. He knows the unwritten rules of Macedonian power. Rivals for the throne are not voted out, they are buried. Hesitate for 1 second, and this time next year is your memorial. How fast does he move? Before the sun sets, Alexander has the army in his grip, and every important noble and minister under soft arrest. The battle-hardened veterans who fought their whole lives for the old king stare at this young prince and face the hardest choice of their lives. Follow him or die right now. They hand over their swords. Then the purge begins. And it plays like a horror film. Alexander sweeps through Philip's other wives and children, anyone with even a trace of a claim to the throne. The pure Macedonian bride and her newborn, they vanish from the historical record at a suspicious speed. Some later accounts say it was Alexander's mother who had them killed, in ways too gruesome to dwell on. But whether Alexander gave the order directly or simply looked the other way, the result is the same. The entire rival branch of the royal family is uprooted. Other potential competitors, like a half-brother named Aridaeus, appear briefly in the historical record and then die. Every thread that could unravel his hold on power is cut. The one family member left alive, a brother called Philip Aridaeus, who had severe intellectual disabilities, reportedly caused by poison administered in childhood by Alexander's mother, keep the harmless puppet. Destroy everyone capable of challenging you. The calculation is ice cold. This is not a peaceful succession. This is a hostile takeover, dressed up as inheritance. Officials who were loyal to the old king find themselves suddenly accused of disloyalty, forced to take their own lives, or simply disappearing. Through all of this, Alexander sends one clear, terrifying signal to the world. The new king is not the one who inherited the throne. The new king is the one who survived after everyone else was eliminated. From his very first day, he rules through terror. When he finally marches east to take on the Persian Empire, what he leaves behind is not a grateful homeland. It's a court paralyzed by fear. The people who remember he was once just a boy waiting for his moment, they keep their mouths sealed shut. The story of Macedon has been rewritten, and the first draft was signed in his father's blood on the theatre floor. This is only the beginning of his madness. With home secured, Alexander begins his Asian campaign. On the surface, it looks like a highlight reel. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, one total victory after another. The Persian Emperor Darius III, running for his life. Governors surrendering in waves. You might think this is just a high-octane war epic, but the real horror story is playing out inside his inner circle. With every victory, every city conquered, and stripped of its gold, something in Alexander shifts. His voice stops giving orders. It starts issuing divine decrees. Imagine your star sales manager wins every quarter, and then one day starts demanding that everyone bow to him before he'll discuss next month's targets. Except Alexander means it literally. The bonfire camaraderie disappears. The veterans who used to sit around fires with him, trading stories and sharing wine, start noticing something wrong in his eyes. He drinks harder than anyone in camp. His emotions are a live grenade, euphoric one moment, then suddenly Arctic cold and lethal. The most dangerous kind of leader isn't the incompetent one. It's the one who keeps score and never argues, he just destroys you. Alexander starts monitoring every expression, every compliment that isn't enthusiastic enough. The men who once wrestled with him in the dirt now rehearse their words 8 times before opening their mouths in his presence. Feel like he's slighted you? He won't debate it. He'll erase you. At this point, simply being the greatest king on earth is no longer enough for Alexander. He needs to be worshipped as a god. What follows is the most deranged loyalty test in the ancient world. Call it Extreme Workplace Manipulation Ancient Edition. Persian court protocol included a ritual called proskynesis, a deep bow before the king, sometimes with the forehead touching the ground. To Persians, this was standard political etiquette, like a formal salute. But for the Greeks and Macedonians, this gesture was reserved exclusively for the gods, no exceptions. You did not do this to another living human being. Picture the suffocating tension of that moment. This makes the worst public humiliation you've ever experienced look mild. Alexander wraps it in the language of cultural diplomacy, a bridge between conquerors and the conquered, he calls it. But this is not cultural fusion. This is a loyalty test wrapped in humiliation. He is demanding that the men who followed him across deserts, who bled on the front lines, who dragged themselves through every hellscape he created, he is demanding they prostrate themselves before a man they once wrestled in the mud as boys. He is asking free men to perform an act that, in their own culture, is the exclusive posture of surrender to something beyond human. The feeling is something like spending 3 sleepless nights crafting something you're genuinely proud of, and having it destroyed before your eyes for reasons that make no sense. Picture the scene in that grand hall. Persian nobles drop to the ground without hesitation, foreheads on the floor, calling out to him in a voice usually reserved for divine beings. Then the Macedonian veteran's turn arrives. The room goes dead. The air turns thick. These men have seen Alexander sick with dysentery. They've seen him howling in pain from his wounds. They've seen him stumble out of his tent drunk and barely functional. They know he's a man, but armed guards line every wall, and the king's eyes move across the room like a snake assessing prey. Dignity or survival? What do you choose? Under that kind of fear, most people fold. Some of them press their foreheads against the cold stone, dignity buried in exchange for another day alive. But some can't do it. Among them, the most defiant is a man named Callisthenes. Callisthenes is not an ordinary figure. He is the court historian, a relative of Aristotle, and a man with freedom of thought coded into his bones. He refuses to bow to a mortal. His resistance becomes the most talked about thing in the entire camp. Alexander's god performance collapses in front of everyone, and Callisthenes is the reason. You think Alexander would laugh it off? Completely wrong. This tyrant's need for revenge has no expiration date. He never forgets a humiliation. Later, he attaches an absurdly thin charge of conspiracy to Callisthenes and throws him in prison. The stubborn historian suffers through brutal treatment and eventually dies in that cell. Do you see what's happening? Alexander's definition of loyalty is completely warped. Brave in battle? Not enough. Helped him win every war? Still not enough. What he needs now is your total psychological submission. He needs everyone around him to publicly and demonstrably acknowledge that Alexander exists above human judgment, closer to the gods than to his own soldiers. Anyone who resists that idea is not a critic. They are a threat, and anyone Alexander considers a threat is basically already dead. This god-making campaign was less about consolidating power and more about an extreme obedience pressure test designed to purge dissent. If you can bring yourself to kneel to cross that line, you've been fully domesticated. The moment you hold back even a fraction, even for the sake of something as basic as self-respect, you've just become the next piece of meat on his cutting board. Think forcing people to bow was Alexander's outer limit? That's barely the appetizer in this dark curriculum. The next two historical figures, both spectacularly wronged, will show you exactly how badly things end when you consider yourself a friend of the boss. First, Parmenion. Not a minor character. The supreme commander of the Macedonian army, the empire's number 2. He was fighting alongside Alexander's father Philip long before Alexander could hold a sword. Before Alexander ever set foot on foreign soil, Parmenion had already been defeating Persian forces in Asia Minor. In terms of experience, reputation, and connections within the officer corps, no one came close to him except the king himself. But in a poisoned hierarchy, being too indispensable is basically a VIP ticket to an early grave. Parmenion had a son named Philotas. Highborn, battle-hardened, commanding the elite companion cavalry, the unit that had won every major engagement alongside Alexander. Celebrated, respected, but not quite smooth enough, not sufficiently flattering on a daily basis. In Alexander's increasingly cult-like court, failing to generate fresh praise every single day was essentially wearing a sign that said, "I'm planning a rebellion." As the campaigns pushed deeper into unknown territory, the relationship between these two men visibly deteriorated. The fatal turning point comes in 330 BC. A common soldier is accused of plotting to kill Alexander, and someone tells Philotas about it. Philotas, for whatever reason, waits a full day before reporting it. He doesn't run to Alexander immediately. That one day of hesitation is the last mistake he ever makes. Alexander explodes. The stated charge is simple. You knew and said nothing. But in the paranoid madhouse Alexander had built, silence equals confession. And if we strip away the surface, this is a calculated strategic elimination. Philotas is the son of the one man who could actually challenge the king's authority. To destroy the old general, you start with the son. What follows is more desperate than any thriller. Philotas is arrested on the spot and dragged before the entire army. Officers who were sharing food and wine with him just days before immediately turn on him, lining up to denounce him publicly. Why the instant reversal? Because everyone understands that anyone who speaks in his defense goes down with him. and then Alexander applies brutal torture, forcing Philotas to confess and to implicate his own father Parmenion in the alleged conspiracy. A confession extracted under torture would be thrown out of any modern courtroom. In Alexander's domain, it is an irrevocable death sentence. The commander of the most elite cavalry in the known world is executed as a traitor. His own former soldiers dispose of his body like garbage. Like a duke drowned in a barrel of wine for being on the wrong side of a succession dispute, no matter how high you flew, when the machine decides to grind you up, it doesn't warn you first. The son is dead. Now how do you deal with the father, hundreds of miles away? 49. Parmenion is in Ecbatana, in what is now Iran, dutifully guarding the empire's treasury and protecting the supply lines that keep the whole war running. He knows nothing about his son's arrest, his torture, his execution. He has no idea he's been named in a conspiracy charge. If you were Alexander, what would you do? Call him back for a confrontation? Not a chance. If Alexander orders that, the 70-year-old general comes back with every question imaginable, and possibly with his troops behind him in open revolt. Alexander cannot allow that, so this supposedly great conqueror does something monstrous. He quietly writes a sealed letter and sends it by fast courier to a handful of Parmenion's deputy commanders, men who owe their positions entirely to Alexander, men who cannot say no. The instruction is devastatingly simple. Kill Parmenion immediately. No arrest, no hearing, no trial. Just elimination. By the time the courier arrives, Philotas's grave is already cold. And the old general who spent more years serving the Macedonian crown than Alexander has been alive is given no chance to say a single word in his own defense. His deputies close in under the pretense of routine business. A signal is given. Swords are drawn. A man in his 70s is cut down by his own subordinates inside his own headquarters. No evidence presented. No charges read aloud. Just a sealed letter and coordinated assassination. When the news spreads through the army, what it produces is not grief. It produces a complete shutdown of the mind, pure terror. Everyone finally understands. If even Parmenion, the most senior, most loyal man in the entire empire, can be slaughtered like an animal without a single conversation, then no one in this army is safe. The veterans realize with absolute clarity, your past victories mean nothing. The king can fabricate a charge against your son, torture him into naming you, and have you killed 1,000 miles away without even showing his face. In this cult, friendship, blood, a lifetime of loyalty, none of it counts as protection. Your only path to survival is absolute, unconditional obedience. Don't comment on how much he's drinking. Don't point out that the army has gone too far, and when he puts on Persian robes and starts playing God, make sure your face shows nothing but reverence. Every single day. Nod, applaud, press your face to the floor, and pray he never looks at you the way he once looked at Philotas. After Parmenion's murder, Alexander completely stops holding back. He has just proven to the world that even the most loyal subordinate can be erased the moment he becomes inconvenient, on nothing more than a king's word. So what do you think happens to a foreign city that dares to resist him? Don't skip ahead. What comes next may cause genuine distress. But I promise this is the dark epic history never told you. For Alexander, simply conquering a city is no longer satisfying. He needs public executions. He needs to make an example so brutal that the whole world flinches. Gaza is the chosen example. Most coastal cities along his route took one look at Alexander, coming and dropped to their knees, handing over hostages and begging for mercy. Gaza refused. The walls were thick, the terrain was elevated, and the garrison commander, a man named Battis, was a devoted loyalist of the Persian crown. Battis is no mythological warrior. He's a professional soldier, a eunuch, a man ordered to hold his post. When faced with Alexander's ultimatum, he doesn't give a speech. He just says no. That single word completely shatters Alexander's ego. In his world, defiance is not a military obstacle, it's a personal insult. It denies him what he craves most, watching someone who resisted him ultimately beg and break. The siege that follows is a massive embarrassment. Alexander is hit by an arrow from an anonymous defender wounded in front of his entire army. Think about what that does to a man who just crushed the Persian emperor and calls himself heaven-sent. It's like the top-ranked player in the game getting killed by a basic mob in the starter zone. A rational commander would have surrounded the city and starved it out, then moved south to Egypt with minimal casualties. Not Alexander. He builds massive earthworks and assault ramps, filling them with human lives. When the walls finally fall, there is no prisoner of war camp. The male defenders are annihilated. The women and children are taken as slaves, and for Battis, Alexander reserves a completely personalized atrocity. Battis is captured alive, covered in blood, bound before Alexander. Alexander demands he beg. Battis says nothing. His silence infuriates Alexander beyond reason. To reclaim his pride, Alexander begins cosplaying his childhood idol Achilles. In the myth, Achilles dragged the body of his enemy Hector around the walls of Troy. But Battis is alive. What happens next is one of the most agonizing deaths in all of recorded history. Alexander has holes bored through Battis's ankles. Ropes are threaded through them. He is tied to the back of a chariot and dragged around the ruins of Gaza alive, until skin tears away from muscle, flesh strips from bone, until the man becomes indistinguishable from the dust and blood beneath him. There is zero military purpose to this. It is a living human being used as a canvas, so Alexander can perform a myth and soothe his wounded ego. If that wasn't enough, the next story introduces what we might call transgenerational collective punishment. Deep in the territories of Asia, Alexander encounters a community descended from a clan called the Branchidae. Their ancestors had surrendered a Greek temple to the Persians during a war 150 years earlier. They were settled in this remote place to avoid reprisals. 150 years. The current villagers are 5 or 6 generations removed from those original people. They've never even seen the temple. When Alexander arrives, these Greek-speaking villagers open their arms in welcome, thinking they're witnessing a miraculous connection to their homeland after generations in exile. Alexander receives them warmly at first. He talks with them. He confirms who they are and where they came from. They probably allowed themselves to imagine the exile was finally ending. Then he declares them a pollution that must be cleansed from the earth. He orders his army into the settlement to kill everyone, men, women, children, without distinction. Every house is torn down and burned. The village is erased from the surface of the earth. Even the trees surrounding it are cut down, as if the land itself must be made to forget. Picture the scene, heavy darkness pressing down, a hellish orange glow eating the edges of everything, deep shadows slashing through the smoke and ruin. All of it because of what someone's long-dead ancestors did before any of these people were born. This is not warfare. This is a severely paranoid man running a deranged moral accounting system, purifying the world according to calculations no one else can follow. Do not assume surrender keeps you safe. Persepolis proves it. This was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, a structure built across generations, crammed with gold and silver, enormous columns supporting roofs inlaid with precious metals, a monument to imperial permanence. Alexander takes it without a fight. He could have made it the crown jewel of his new empire, but alcohol and a tyrant with unlimited power are a catastrophic combination. One night, Alexander and his inner circle are deeply drunk. A woman named Thais, companion to one of his generals, half joking, half sincere, suggests, "Let's burn this place down, as payback for what the Persians did to Athens." Why not? You think Alexander would hesitate because the building is too magnificent? Within minutes, torches hit the timber. The greatest architectural achievement of the Persian Empire burns into an orange inferno against the night sky. Voices urging restraint are swallowed by the roar of the flames and the cheers of drunks. Generations of art, records, and knowledge gone in one night of drunk-fueled resentment. You see the pattern now. Gaza, the Branchidae, Persepolis. None of this is bridge building. Alexander doesn't just kill, he erases the memory of resistance. He crushes entire civilizations beneath his feet to retroactively justify his own brutality. In his script, he is always the executor of destiny. And the entire world pays for his impulses. After all of this, after burning world wonders and wiping out innocent villages, you might assume the army following him has become so numb to death, so stripped of everything human, that nothing could break them. You would be wrong. Even the most hardcore war machine has a point of failure. Imagine working for the most relentlessly demanding boss imaginable. in a hellish cycle for 10 years. Every day he tells you, one more Persian stronghold, and then we go home and you'll get everything you were promised. But the feast never arrives. By the time the army reaches the Hyphasis River, the edge of the known world at the time, something in the entire force breaks at once. The enemy here doesn't fight with formations and swords. They fight with war elephants, ancient heavy tanks crashing directly into the phalanx, and the monsoon climate has corroded the iron armor and weapons the soldiers depend on to stay alive. Veteran soldiers look at the unknown waters ahead, broader than any river in Greece, and the last thread snaps. They look at each other. A consensus forms, unprecedented in their entire history. This overtime shift is done. We are not working one more day. They want to see their homes before disease and mud swallow them whole. They want to hold their wives and children again. And so this army, haunted by death for a decade, looks directly at the man who claims to be a god and says no. How does a self-styled divine CEO respond to a mass walkout? How does? He throws a tantrum. He storms into his tent and stays there for days, waiting for the soldiers to come crawling back out of guilt and loyalty. Outside, complete silence. Nobody comes to apologize. The veterans mean it. They are going home. With no options left, Alexander agrees to turn back. If you think that's the end of it, if you think the boss finally came around, you deeply underestimate the revenge instinct of someone with antisocial psychopathy. A cult leader who runs on fear cannot accept his followers drawing a line. In his warped worldview, how can a god yield to the demands of mortals? So he quietly makes a decision. The road home will not be a reward. It will be a reckoning. Everyone who dared say enough is going to pay for it with their lives. There is a safe, well-supplied retreat route available. He has used it before. He ignores it completely. He orders tens of thousands of soldiers and their accompanying civilians straight into the most merciless landscape of the ancient world, the Gedrosian Desert. He has intelligence. He knows a previous army was destroyed attempting this crossing. He goes anyway. Why? Pure performance. He wants to prove he can cross a wasteland that even the great Persian kings couldn't survive. As for the tens of thousands behind him, they are raw material for building his legend. Picture this in your mind. An oppressive, lightless world of dead earth tones. A merciless sun driving hard shadows down from a bleached sky, cracked ground covered in the footprints of the despairing. Heat doesn't just come from above. The rocks radiated upward from below, like a furnace working from both sides. Water is no longer a comfort. It is the single criterion separating the living from the dead. Rivers marked on maps are dry cracks. Wells are empty or already drained by advance units. Soldiers begin hiding water. Men who stood together in every battle turn blades on each other for a mouthful of muddy liquid. The slowest and weakest fall behind. Nobody stops. The desert dries them where they drop. Imagine mothers with cracked, bleeding lips holding children whose mouths have gone white, stumbling through burning sand until they fall and don't get up. Every step forward leaves a trail of bodies. And where is our hero? History loves to retell this story as proof of his nobility. A scout finds a small amount of water and brings it to Alexander in a helmet. Every soldier around stares at it with the wild desperation of men at the edge of death. Alexander looks around, then tips the helmet over and pours it into the sand. "I won't drink alone," he declares. Some romantic historians call this extraordinary brotherhood. No, this is the most sadistic performance art in the history of leadership. The water is gone. The tens of thousands still dying of thirst remain exactly as dead. This pointless death march through the desert kills thousands upon thousands of people, not just soldiers, but the merchants and craftsmen and families who travelled with the army for years, who staked their survival on staying close to this king, and discovered that closeness to Alexander was itself a death sentence. When the skeletal, hollow-eyed survivors finally stagger out of the desert, Alexander has achieved one deeply dark objective. The people left alive, physically and psychologically destroyed, belong to him completely. They watch their wives and children and brothers die of thirst at their feet. Some part of them would gladly kill him with bare hands, but their bodies have no choice but to obey. He used tens of thousands of corpses to successfully demolish the army's will to resist, and pressed fear back into their DNA. You think surviving the death desert meant a bonus, a promotion, finally going home to your family? Think again. This conqueror's mind operates beyond the limits of what most humans can imagine. In 324 BC, the army finally reaches Susa, once the power center of the Persian Empire, and Alexander announces something unprecedented: a mass wedding. 10,000 Macedonian soldiers, scarred, worn-down veterans smelling of years of war, are matched with 10,000 Persian noblewomen and forced to marry. The boss himself leads by example, taking 2 daughters of former Persian emperors as wives simultaneously. You might think this is some grand gesture of multicultural unity. It is not. The calculation underneath is genuinely disturbing. This is a human breeding program dressed in royal ceremony. Many of these soldiers have wives and children waiting for them in Macedon. They have spent years crawling through death, holding on to the hope of going home and being held again. Now the boss assigns them a new wife. Get into her room tonight. No discussion. Even the coldest medieval monarchs, the ones who arranged marriages like chess moves and had rivals quietly disposed of, would likely recoil at the idea of treating soldiers as livestock to be paired for. Breeding. In Alexander's view, you are not a person. You have no feelings. The family waiting on the other side of the world doesn't exist. You are a genetic delivery mechanism for producing the next generation of absolute loyalty. He's not just not giving you a raise after 10 years. He's arranging your marriage and claiming your children will work for his dynasty forever. This is manipulation pressed into the bloodline itself. And if forced pairing wasn't the final humiliation, the real soul-crushing move is still coming. While these veterans are seething and playing unwilling grooms, Alexander quietly recruits large numbers of young local men from the conquered territories, trains them in Macedonian fighting techniques, and incorporates them directly into the frontline units. The name he gives this new force? The Successors. When that word reaches the veterans who have bled for him from the Balkans to the banks of the Indus, something in their chest simply breaks. Put yourself there. 10 years of frontline blood, a body full of injuries, and the boss deciding you're too old stops your benefits. Brings in a batch of outsourced interns who have no hometown allegiances, owe everything to him alone, and hands them your core position. The veterans see the truth clearly now. They have been replaced. The rage finally detonates at Opis, near the Tigris River. Alexander announces, with fake magnanimity, that elderly veterans will be honorably discharged and allowed to go home, their positions filled by Eastern troops. The entire army erupts. Macedonian soldiers shout with fury, jabbing fingers at Alexander, demanding to know if he loves these barbarian recruits more than the brothers who bled beside him. Picture the moment: dark earth tones under a leaden sky, dramatic shadows slashing through the scene. Alexander launching out of his seat like a cornered animal provoked beyond reason. He has no interest in talking about labor conditions or shared history. When his authority is challenged, he has only one response: physical elimination. He scans the crowd, points at a handful of the loudest voices, and orders them executed on the spot. Men who were sharing grievances beside you 1 second are cut down and bleeding into the dirt the next. Thousands of soldiers freeze in place, watching comrades die for speaking a true thing aloud. A bone-deep terror, like poison smoke, rolls through the entire army in seconds. And here comes the darkest joke of all, something you would never predict. With fresh blood still warm in the air, the man who was just ordering executions transitions seamlessly into beloved elder brother mode. He begins weeping. He embraces soldiers. He delivers a speech about loyalty and brotherhood. The acting is flawless. He would deserve a Lifetime Achievement Award from any academy on earth. A beating followed by a blood-soaked concession. This is the final mechanism that keeps his empire of terror running. But can a machine built on killing and performance keep running forever? What happens to a man who calls himself a god? 323 BC. Shortly after the mutiny at Opis, Alexander returns to Babylon. He's only 32. He's shattered the Persian Empire and turned his army into an extension of his will. In his mind, the story has barely started. He's already planning the invasion of Arabia, already sketching out a fleet to push into the Western Mediterranean, but the body doesn't care about plans. After a night of intense drinking at a friend's house, Alexander falls ill. At first, it's high fever and acute pain. Within days, the man who rode through fields of corpses without breaking can no longer sit up. Then he can no longer speak clearly. Around the bed stand the generals who helped him kill and conquer. What are they thinking? That they hope he recovers? Don't be ridiculous. These men watched him use a sealed letter to have Parmenion assassinated. They watched him drag a living man to pieces behind a chariot. They watched him execute veterans in front of the whole army for saying something true. Every one of them knows, if this man gets better, every old score gets settled. He has no clear heir. His wife Roxanne is pregnant with a child not yet born. He has a half-brother with severe mental disabilities. Neither of them can control what's in this room, a circle of warlords who have been waiting. They gather around the bed and ask the question that will determine the fate of the known world. Who do you leave all of this to? Listen carefully to what is supposedly the darkest, most devastating final word in ancient military history. The nearly voiceless king, according to legend, uses the last of his strength to push out a reply. To the strongest, to the strongest. This is not a succession plan. This is detonating a bomb inside the room. These words are a direct message to every armed killer present. Whoever has the hardest fist and the most efficient body count, the world is yours. Weeks after falling ill, Alexander dies. He doesn't make it to 33. No climactic final battle, just a sweat-soaked, organ-failing wreck of a body. And the men in the room don't wait for the body to cool before they start calculating how to divide his territory. But what happens after his death is where the real reckoning arrives. Remember how he forced people to prostrate before him? How he demanded to be worshipped as a god? The moment he dies, his corpse becomes a magnificent black joke. The plan was an extravagant preservation, his body reportedly submerged in honey inside a golden sarcophagus, to be transported home to Macedon for a proper burial. But in a world without surveillance or tracking, something happens that rivals any heist from history's most secured vaults. One of his most trusted companions, Ptolemy, who had declared himself ruler of Egypt, intercepts the funeral procession and steals the body. Ptolemy is shrewd enough to understand, whoever controls the corpse controls the claim to Alexander's legacy. And so the man who spent his entire life treating others as instruments, the tyrant who bent the whole world to his will, ends up being snatched by a former subordinate after death and dragged to Egypt as a trophy. Displayed, visited, used. Is there a better final insult to a life spent obsessing over absolute control, and the empire he built through forced marriages and mass executions the one that was supposed to last forever? Within 40 years of his death, his former brothers in arms have torn the world apart in decades of bloody civil war. His bloodline? His son Alexander IV, born to Roxanne after his death, is murdered in his youth, along with his mother, by political enemies. He slaughtered his own extended family to seize power. His direct bloodline was then systematically exterminated in return. So the next time someone rhapsodizes about Alexander's military genius, his great imperial vision, his legacy of civilization, give them these facts. Remember, Battis of Gaza dragged alive behind a chariot until he came apart. Remember the villagers of the Branchidae massacred without exception, for an act their ancestors committed 150 years before they were born. Remember Persepolis, one of the greatest architectural achievements in human history, burned to ash because he was drunk and wanted to impress someone. And remember the tens of thousands left to die of thirst in the Gedrosian Desert, used as punishment for the crime of having limits. Those pristine, perfectly proportioned faces on marble statues are built from the bones and blood of people with no names. Real history was never a fairy tale. This right here is the actual bill, the one that's been hidden behind the myth for 2,300 years. That's everything for tonight. Good night.